Very warm welcome to 2021 EPA's community to the first event of the year. My name is John Ryan and I'm responsible for the policy and projects at Emerging Payments Association. We're back again for our annual look at the payments, just like we did last year. But before we look forward, we need to look back and review what we did last year. As part of this year's event, we've changed the format a little. We still have our advisory board members partaking, but we'll be making an award tonight for the Sage of Payments, an inaugural award, and that's based on the best predictions that were made at last year's event. We have online questions, of course, and you will get your chance to ask questions at the end of or during this session, and we will answer them towards the end. For those of you who don't know Emerging Payments, we are about improving the lives everywhere through payments. We do this through events such as this, which helps us to set our priorities, and by running research projects. It's all about bringing the payments community together for collaboration to create the unified voice. I'm joined tonight by a very esteemed panel who are the members of our advisory board. We have Daniel Zito, who is the chairperson of the advisory board and also FinTech lead at Standard Chartered Bank in Hong Kong. We've got Andy White, deputy advisory board chair, and also CEO of Australia Payments Network. We have Aman Kohli, Payments and Capital Markets, head of from DXC Technology in London. And last but not least, we have Stephen Chan, who is head of government relations for PayPal in the region. A big welcome to you all. To warm things up, we're going to do a quick survey just to get some feedback from the audience and get your views on the thoughts of what happened last year. So you should see that coming up on your screen shortly. Please take your time to tick as many of the multiple choices as you feel were the big events in payments for last year, and we'll have a look at them as we go through this session. I'll just move that along. Okay. Right, so, all right. So Camilla, my co-director general, who ran this event last year, and I can only hope that we can replicate the fantastic job that she did in that inaugural event. To set the scene today, I want to quickly update you on what EPA has done in the past year. Basically, we grew up, we advanced in many areas, and with the events that took place last year, it was actually proved to be a great platform for us to do more of what we do across the region, because we were able to do it in a digital manner. We went from 20 events in 2019 to 87 events last year, and we also increased our projects from 1 to 6, and that gave us significant member engagement and also engaging with industry professionals. One point I would like to add is that we entered into several partnerships and we collaborated with organizations such as the Asia Pacific Financial Forum, G20, Bank of International Settlements, and CPMI. And one of the most exciting partnerships that we've entered into in the year was with the Institute of International Finance in Washington around the G20 cross-border payments roadmap. And that's a 4-year initiative that you will be hearing plenty more of as we move forward in the year. So to kick things off, I would like to ask the panel to share their thoughts on the EPA values that were identified on last year's call, and to check in and see how those values held up for 2020. So I'll just display those on the screen. But seeing as Stephen, as you're the top of my screen here, I'll just ask you to maybe kick us off with your thoughts about those values.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Thanks to John and Camilla and to the EPA organization. As I reflect on last year, I also think about PayPal's role and why we support EPA and join EPA. And I think a lot of what EPA has done the past year really aligns with the core mission of PayPal. And I would say everything that happened last year, EPA has really fulfilled all the core values. And I couldn't think of a better organization at the right time at the right place. I think COVID really has accelerated digital payments, and EPA has been the forefront of that in identifying emerging topics that are relevant not only in our industry but across cross-sectorial areas as well. Things like cross-border trade, open banking, looking at data sharing, and also what Camilla has been doing in championing women in the payment space. So if I were to highlight a couple here, I would say helping members really understand some of the issues that have emerged during COVID and the challenges and opportunities, especially in the payment space. And then the second is around the collective voice. This past year, there has been a couple working groups that came out of EPA. One is around regulations, and through John's leadership, has been really able to gather financial institutions, fintechs, payments players to bring a collective voice for the industry in weighing in some of the regulatory developments for it payments, for it fintech, or areas in data and cybersecurity. So those would be the two areas I'd like to highlight.
Great. And Danielle, I'm going to pass it over to you now to hear your thoughts around those values.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much, Stephen, as well, for a good insight from PayPal and certainly on the ground. Hello to everyone. Actually, it's been fun as I scroll through the attendees list. It's been really good fun to see quite a number of names that I recognize. So shout out to all of you guys, and really great to see you in what many of my colleagues at the bank are certainly calling Q5 2020, which I think is actually probably a little bit of a sense of, I guess, how we feel about this at the moment. And, certainly when it came to the work that we did with EPA Asia, and I'm speaking, I suppose, here in my role as the chair of the advisory board, which is something I've been doing with the team for the last 2 years, and saw more recently as part of Standard Chartered Bank. But we've really, 2020 really was quite an interesting year in the sense of, may you live in interesting times. I think that certainly the core values that we put forward in 2019 that you can see on screen there, quite a number of them were right on the mark. However, I feel that perhaps not quite in the way that we expected. There was a huge focus on payments, a huge focus on the issues, challenges, and opportunities. Any of you guys who've had time to go through that G20 roadmap that John was talking about earlier before, certainly the EPA Asia team spent a long time going through that and working with the BIS and FSB and looking deeply into what some of the challenges were in the region in payments, and exposing some of those shortfalls. And I think that where we felt that perhaps in 2020 we would see a lot of development in the regulations, I think there was a lot of talking, a lot of opportunities around the collaboration, which is great, but we were yet to really see a huge amount of that development. I think the other one that really kind of came out quite interestingly in 2020 was actually looking at e-commerce and cross-border trade. I think everyone was thinking that there would be acceleration, but of course the COVID story was so much bigger than that. And I think that the recent China GDP numbers we've just seen, as well as some of the news around the shortage of shipping containers from China to EU and US, I mean, that really just screams the story of how 2020 really was a very interesting year, looking at the evolution of e-commerce and cross-border trade. So certainly not in the way we expected, but and certainly I think an acceleration in many respects, but very interesting to see how that will play out through the remainder of or coming into this year in 2021.
Great, thanks, Danielle. I'd like to pass to Andy White now.
Thanks, John, and Happy New Year, everybody. hopefully it isn't Q5 2020, and we can have a sense of optimism about 2021 moving forward. I'll echo a couple of things that that Stephen and Dan have already pointed towards. I think my sort of value that we've definitely represented, I think, in EPA Asia is collaborating on regional payment issues. I think, you know, coming from an Australian standpoint, I think that the value add that EPA Asia really has is that regional focus and that ability to collaborate across the region. And I think the two examples of that others have already mentioned. One is definitely the work that was done on open data across the region, and I think the importance of that was that it was genuinely regional research on open data. You know, we're probably all familiar with what's going on in our individual jurisdiction, but I think the value is really that research across region and looking for similarities and differences, and the fact that that was done in partnership with the Asia Pacific Financial Forum. So that had some really good backing and enabled that collaboration and that research to really have value, not just for us as an organisation or our members, but also for policymakers. And the second one, I guess, being a bit more forward-looking, is a similar opportunity that I see in the work that Dan mentioned on cross-border payments. As John said, I mean, that's a 4 to 5 year roadmap that the Financial Stability Board has published there, all around enhancing cross-border payments. It's therefore definitely a sweet spot for a regional organisation like EPA Asia to really understand what that means for the different corridors within the region on cross-border payments. And again, I think, you know, it's an opportunity to work with G20, FSB, IIF, and so on. And again, really help those policymakers think about that topic. So yeah, really looking forward to continuing that kind of collaboration heading into 2021.
Yeah, excellent. And your input, Andy, is absolutely valuable to, you know, the Australian perspective is key to get that region, you know, to feed into the region. And last but not least, Aman Kohli, who is very early in the morning. So Aman, do you want to share some thoughts about those values on the screen about payment organization, how we've been tracking?
Yeah, and hello everyone. So I think I'll echo everything the previous panelists have said. Q5 2020, I am happily going to steal. We've been referring to this as December the 37th anyway. As we go through January. I think the big thing about payments has been early part of COVID mania was about institutions dealing with the increased demand. And by and large, with one or two exceptions, I think everyone did a really good job at just coping with the increased digital demand. You know, we had these great things that happened early in the year where credit card or card fraud detection system said, hold it, this can't be right. You're ordering something from an online clothes retailer while you're at home. Normally you're ordering a sandwich next to where you work. And that kind of took a while for those systems to kind of catch up and realize, yes, no, we're all at home now. I think the other thing as well, though, is that there's been a pivot to what are the value add that can be built on top of these digital payment pipes now, and how can we make them more meaningful, right? So there's been a lot of talk around the role of BNPL in payments, right? And how do you extend that into it? And I think that's been a big theme towards the back end of calendar 2020, not COVID 2020. And I really think the coming together of some of the innovations within the fintech sector and the private market in general is stimulating regulators in a way. You know, the G20 work, the GIS work, as you say, is a direct result of that. You know, let's continue to remove friction. Let's have that safety and security built in, but in a meaningful way, not in this kind of weird show up with, you know, your entire family tree and, you know, stamped by every government agency that's ever been known to man. Moving to more digital forms, and we might actually see actual digital identity soon. He crosses his fingers and prays. And I think those are the big things, right? And I think what we're going to be seeing as well is EPA Asia's role in this as well. I think the organization has done a remarkable job at being the voice for a broad constituency.
Excellent. Thank you, Aman. And certainly echo the thoughts around the innovation too. We've certainly seen a lot of it. I'm going to now just, I know some of you touched on what did happen last year as well in that, so, but I will ask you a bit more detail. But I'm just going to quickly share the results from the polling, so we can just get a feel for what people thought. And look, I'll let the panel comment on this, but I would also like the panel to share their own thoughts as well. Sorry, can you still see those results? Yeah. So I'll let the panel sort of include these and their thoughts around what they saw as the big trends in 2020 then. So I'm going to pass it over to Danielle to kick this one off, if you wouldn't mind, Danielle.
Yeah, sure. And I think I'll just keep this reasonably brief, because actually, I think that everybody probably saw this, the pandemic was really the number one thing, and the acceleration that saw it. I'm actually quite surprised to see how few people actually also saw cryptocurrencies as being a major trend. And I think we will get to that a little bit later. But I certainly also felt that we reached quite a tipping point last year that is going to continue into this year. And I think that we can spend a little time on that later.
Great. And Stephen, how about you? What did you see back last year? So, well, I'll just give Stephen a chance to gather these thoughts. So maybe we'll go back to you, Andy, first, and if you could just.
Sorry, my mute button.
There you go. Yep.
Okay, sorry, my mute button wasn't working.
Yeah.
I was going to say. Let me continue a little bit of Aman's earlier theme around e-commerce. You know, there are two themes that stood out for me. One is around how rapid the adaptation of e-commerce that we have seen, especially among the consumers due to COVID. You know, by many estimates, the pace of e-commerce penetration has accelerated by several years in perhaps, you know, a very short span of time of a single quarter. And as a result, we have seen this great demand and acceleration, significant acceleration towards digital payment adoption. And from a PayPal perspective, we have seen that compress in a matter of a quarter. And what also interesting came out of this is we have seen an emergence of new segments that we traditionally don't think about. For example, especially in the 50 and over, what we call silver tech. That surprisingly was one of the fastest growing segment for us. And in that segment, the spend per transaction on the average is higher than other segments. And from a PayPal perspective as well, each quarter we keep on achieving higher milestones. And so as a result, we are, you know, on target on a run rate of about, you know, hitting $1 trillion in payment volume. And just in third quarter alone, we will release our fourth quarter next month. We added 15 million active accounts, and on track to hitting 70 million users for all of 2020. So those are phenomenal achievement in the payment space, and just to give the scale of acceleration that we are seeing in the space. And the other area is around regulations. I think that the theme that came out of regulation this year is around strengthening compliance. We have seen that the PDS2, the EU Payment Services Directive 2, came into full effect last year. Things like, you know, enhanced verification. We also have seen new payments regulations, such as the MAS Payment Services Act, also came into full force, along with a number of strengthened AML regulations and procedures across the region. And so, and as more and more activities go digital, there's an increase in cyber security challenges. And so regulators are increasingly focusing on compliance issues. On the regulation side, the other side of the coin is there were also missed opportunities. I think COVID has derailed or shift priorities from a lot of the financial services, fintech regulations, to kind of a back burner as COVID took over many government priorities, and rightly so, especially around stimulus packages, recovery support for SMEs, and health-related regulation as well. And some of the areas, unfortunately, took a backseat that could have, I think, moved forward in terms of the fintech and payment space is around open banking. There might have been more progress that could have been made around digital ID, e-signature, remote onboarding, for example. We have seen several of these initiatives, unfortunately, been delayed. For example, in Hong Kong, the Open API project in phase 3 and 4 was delayed. We have seen some of the open banking, open data initiatives in Singapore also was delayed a little bit. And also some of the payments regulations in Japan and Australia that got delayed as well because of COVID. And so, those are the two themes that I want to highlight.
So thanks, Stephen. I absolutely agree with the e-commerce piece. And I think what we see in here as well is that that's actually brought in so many more participants into the payment world who didn't actually, consider payments, but now they're very much in the thick of it. And key point about the regulations too. Hopefully it's not too much extra work for us next year. Aman, I'm just going to let you have another shot here. If there was more points you wanted to add or comment on what you saw earlier on the results.
Trying again with mute off. I think a couple of the interesting things, and there's been some chat on it as well, and I should have mentioned it, is there's been a greater standardization and adoption of standards without all this kind of crying and belly aching you see sometimes, right? Because COVID happened and people said, right, we're on a particular train, we've just got to continue with this stuff. So whether it's shown up as ISO 20022, or other things around the compliance side of things, it's just taken as lingua franca now, which is good. It's about time, blah blah blah, right? But it's great that it's there, and that's going to open up a lot more capability, both in cross-border flows around some of the other parts of ISO 20022, but also in things like cards and ACH payments as well. And I think those are kind of big things that have come out of it. I think some of the interesting results of the poll are, I certainly would have expected more cryptocurrencies to come out, but I'm a geek and I'm interested in this stuff. So that's just there. But some of the things around cyber risk, cybersecurity is a huge part. We've seen a huge uptake, for example, in companies being subjected to cyber ransom and ransomware attacks. And when you talk to anybody who is running any sort of payment rail or financial system right now that's open, they're just under a deluge, because not only are we home, so are some very talented people stuck at home with nothing to do. So they're just taking cyber baseball bats and trying to hit on these walls and locks and try to get in.
Yeah, some interesting and scary analogies there to know what's lurking out there. Andy, on that note, what did you see last year?
Well, I think it was interesting to note that piece around mobile that came out very strongly. Growth of mobile seemed to, and I guess that links with the point around the pandemic, and we've all kind of experienced that. So I think it's the pandemic forcing us towards use of e-commerce and use of mobile. I guess the interesting bit with that will be how sticky both of those things are moving forward from a UX perspective, and you would imagine pretty sticky, because they're both user experiences that the people try out and really love, and therefore tend to stay with. So you'd expect that. I think the piece that it wasn't sort of mentioned in there as a question, but the piece that is interesting to me is also, and it's kind of to Aman's point about cybersecurity, is how fraud has changed as well, I think, because of the pandemic, and certainly what we're seeing. I guess the good news on that is that, with the substantive growth of e-commerce, you'd probably expect to see a substantive growth of card not present fraud, and that hasn't necessarily happened, or at least hasn't happened in Australia. And I think other countries are also seeing the benefit of some industry work on trying to deal with that, which has stood them in good stead as e-commerce has grown. So, if you're an e-commerce merchant, you've actually seen the best of both worlds. You've seen transactions grow, but you haven't seen fraud grow. So that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, to the point about talented people at home. Unfortunately, some of those talented people are fraudsters, and they don't just give up just because something's become hard, they move on to something that they think might be a bit easier, and that certainly seems to be scams at the moment. And I think that's certainly where we're kicking off industry work to look at how we deal with those, how we educate consumers on scams, how we try to promote secure channels for them to use, because unfortunately, you've seen examples where those scams have deliberately targeted things like government stimulus payments, for example, and so scams are horrible at the best of times, but they're even more horrible when you're trying to deal with a pandemic.
Yeah, and Andy, you obviously did highlight the game of phones last year, as you called it, and absolutely played out. And I do think that to link this, the mobile and the scams, actually, we did see, certainly personally, I felt that, I was getting a lot more of those auto calls and so forth. So I think that's where we've seen a lot of it play out, but hopefully it does get resolved. So just the last panel question I want to ask before we sort of move into more open questions is around what we're seeing for what we see on the agenda for 2021. And I know when we were at this point last year, I do want to credit Andy again. You did really get some great calls, but you did specifically call out the resilience in payments, and I thought that was it wasn't that obvious to everyone at that time. So I'm going to actually give you the chance to go first again, Andy, here, and tell us what you're seeing as those trends that are coming up now for 2021.
Okay, thanks, John. So I'm going to go with 3 Ds this year. I'm going to go with data, digital identity, which has already got a mention, and digital currency, and specifically central bank digital currency. So I think on data, the interesting bit there is, and Aman would know this well, that the UK has just had its 3rd anniversary of open banking. What the data around the open data in the UK suggests is that open banking takes time to mature. So it sort of needed those 3 years. So if you look at the number of API calls, those have grown from just over 60 million in 2018 to around 5 billion last year. And the number of payments using open banking has grown from just over 300,000 in 2018 to over 3 million in 2020. So I'll suggest that as we move to digital and as open banking or open data starts to mature in some parts of the Asian region, you're likely to witness a similar pattern there and starting this year. On digital identity, I'm hoping for some good news for Aman, who said, we might get to actually having one. I'm going to suggest that the pandemic will actually accelerate digital identity services, and part of that is, related to the previous point on data. Part of it is related to that game of phones point on use of mobile. There's no doubt that things like government stimulus payments would have been easier and less prone to fraud had we had a digital identity. The same could definitely be said for contact tracing in terms of its ease and its usability. And the same will be said for things like vaccination certificates. I was on a call with Dave Birch the other day, and he was talking about the vaccination certificates in the UK. An interesting aside is that you might notice the second person vaccinated in the UK was called William Shakespeare. It doesn't get any more English than that. But anyway, he was photographed holding his vaccination certificate, which was a bit of cardboard like we all used to have with old vaccines when we were kids. And within about 10 minutes, you could buy them on eBay for £5 in the UK. We need to get beyond that. We need to get a digital identity that says, I've been vaccinated or I haven't been vaccinated. And again, that is a reason, that is a use case while you'll start to see digital identity services. And I'd suggest you start to see them this year for that and other reasons. And then finally on digital currencies and particularly central bank digital currencies, I think Asia's really well placed, better placed than other regions in terms of the developments that we've seen to date. We've obviously seen the Chinese trials, and they've been thinking about this for 6 years now. Well established. You saw late last year the issuance of digital renminbi to citizens in Shenzhen and Suzhou. And certainly everybody's expectation is that when you fast forward to 2022, that attendees at the Winter Olympics and Paralympics will be using digital renminbi. You've also got Cambodia that started its CBDC trial in October. You've got the Bank of Japan announcing that they'll do a feasibility study starting in April this year. So I'm expecting that we'll get to central bank digital currencies becoming much more of a topic in 2021. And those are the 3Ds.
Yeah, I love it, Andy. Keep coming with those expressions. We'll remember this one for next year too. Seeing as you mentioned Aman, I'm just going to get straight back to Aman and see if he had anything to add to what he's saying coming up next year.
Yeah, well, I'd counter with the 6 Fs, more floppy and unthought out. But I did make some notes on this, which is I was counting it twice. You know what? I agree with pretty much. I think everything that's been said about looking forward. Definitely, central bank issued currencies are going to be more real, if not in people's virtual wallets throughout 21. We're seeing here in Europe that the Bank of France, the Bank of England, the EBA, Bank of Sweden, they're all looking at these things, and beyond just kind of on whiteboards, there are trials happening, there are experiments being run, there are positions being sought, and we're going to see the result of all that work that happened in 2020 coming to fruition and being accelerated. Europe's very conservative, right? It's not as willing to experiment as Asia, for example. So I think this is an area where Asia is really going to lead, and which is great, right? Because it's a more natural way to work as we become wholly digital. I think we're going to see more interconnectivity of payment systems. So one of the reasons why I think digital payments survived so well and were resilient in 2020 was not everything was relying on one pipe or two pipes. Different countries have their own systems and they were made resilient. And now I think through standardization and other things that are happening, interoperability between these in-country systems and different schemes are going to become more of a thing. I think another thing I'm seeing as well is the Middle East is turning into a corridor, right? So in old world, it was a kind of major hub for shipping. I think in terms of supply chain now, digital supply chain and actual supply chain, it's becoming a place, right? That we're seeing a lot of inbound and outbound flows kind of centering around there because it becomes a payment release point. Once you reach the UAE, your goods have reached here, you can now start releasing payments going down your supply chain or whatever it is, right? As well as the consumer flows that are being remitted throughout Asia and Africa and Europe from there. I think we are going to see an increase in the digital divide, which is unfortunate. Until we find a way to get digital identity and access to these systems in a way to include those who are digitally excluded. And we need to think about how that's going to happen. And there are great examples from Asia and also from Africa that we can adopt and learn from. But also businesses, right? You've had a lot of large businesses who just couldn't act quick enough, but I think you also have had a lot of SMEs who have been facing a challenge on how do we react? How do we, how can I deliver my flowers in a digital way, right? How can I, I'm a little restaurant. How do I cope with this and get the payments going? And I think a lot of the work that Shopify and Square have done throughout the last couple of years will bear fruit here and hopefully will be mimicked and taken on. That payments is more than just paying for a takeout restaurant to your delivery driver, right? It's all about that end-to-end service and what do you actually need. And that's where people like Square and Shopify have done a fabulous job around that. But I think 2021 will be a little bit more choppy than 2020. And some of that has to do with some of the issues raised here around digitization, standardization. Some of that has to do with more sophisticated cyber attacks. But then we're also see the rise of AI and magic math through things like zero knowledge proofs for building resilience around interbank systems and things like that. So lots of change, I'd say.
Great. Thank you for bringing up the F words. Danielle runs a group, a chat group with a similar title, I believe. So that's your cue, Danielle, to give us some thoughts for next year or for this year.
I can't lay claim for starting that group, but I was almost going to wear the T-shirt today. That sits with Renee Mashaw, but my F Words T-shirts was almost on the agenda. Look, I think there's been a range of really, really awesome thematics that have been raised today. And so I did obviously put the crypto and CBDCs, or at least under the digital currencies bracket. I think that there's been a huge amount of work done in 2020 and will continue and actually probably become even bigger in 2021. So I think I might actually take a slightly different angle on it to some of my panelists who I think have covered at least the regulatory side, as well as what's sort of happening on the central bank digital currency front. But actually, if you take a step back and you look at the broad thematic of CBDCs and all of these things, what I'm actually kind of seeing and expect to probably see more of, and will become quite tricky in 2021, is actually a bigger push or more focus around competition in payment systems. And actually, this is one that's quite big for me, because I think when you look at what's actually happening on a macro sense in terms of the US and China, what's happening around SWIFT, CBDCs really are an expression of basically trying to ensure that you have this battle for sovereignty. So you've obviously got the China DCEP, which is making a play for, and I think has really been accelerated from some of the things that have been happening in all of the US-China tensions and the weaponization of sanctions. So obviously there's a very, very strong incentive for that to continue, and in against that you've also got increasing use of the euro and in trade, etc. So I think that there is definitely a thematic there, but then when you actually sort of put that alongside other key developments that have been happening quietly throughout the last 2 years, you've got people like Visa who are launching really interesting and innovative new plays in platforms. So whether it's things like Visa B2B Connect, MasterCard with all of their acquisitions, obviously also looking to do all sorts of interesting things in terms of supporting proliferation of their own payment rails. And of course, you've got a lot of work that's actually happening at a regional level with the interconnectivity of different sort of payment and clearing systems. So that has been a very big thematic underneath the sort of the G20 roadmap. And I do actually think that, when you step back and you look at what all of the developments that are happening in this really is about increasing competition. And then actually looking at that competition thematic as well, the other thing that I think is really quite strong in 2020, and again, kind of trying to differentiate myself here, is I do want to bring to the table the notion of antitrust. We've obviously had some very, very big news that's been happening in the last sort of couple of months. Everything from the Western side of things, where obviously the big sort of deal that happened between I think it was MasterCard and Plaid, that obviously fell through. So sorry, was it MasterCard or Visa? But yeah, the Visa's acquisition obviously fell through, and both of those two having to walk away because of concerns from the regulators there. Same thing with Ant Group over in China. Obviously, very, very big noises from a lot of the regulators there about their concerns with respect to the dominance of the two key players in those in that market, and all of the moves they're potentially making now to ensure that all of the different parts of the group are regulated for the activities they should be doing, with consideration of whether or not some of those aspects actually should become a little bit more utility-like or operated potentially as more like a state-owned entity. So I think that, again, that comes back down to this sort of dynamic that we're seeing, where there's been quite a lot of proliferation and a lot of investigation done on different ways in which you can move money from point A to point B, or company A to company B. But I think that given there has been that proliferation and that there has been such dominance around really big players on both the Eastern and the Western fronts, I think that now regulators are actually starting to take a step back and to say, well, actually, what do we want this industry to start looking like? How can we actually take advantage of all of the new technologies that are coming up, whether it's machine learning and all of the other innovations and standardization that is starting to take place in the industry right now? And how can we ensure that when the industry is growing, we don't actually end up just increasingly entrenching what does appear to become more like dominance in some of these payment systems that are emerging? So I do think that these thematics are going to be quite strong. They will have impacts in investment and M&A this year, obviously coupled with the very, very sort of dynamic or changed landscape we have on the investment side as well, where there is a huge amount of, we've got rampant share markets, very, very large pools of private equity wanting to be deployed against strategic capital. So I think that certainly the M&A space in the fintech and payments space is actually also going to be quite different this year.
Wow, that's really interesting thoughts there, Danielle. Really at the macro level, just to put it into perspective, payments growing massively and regulators concerned, and yet you're predicting that, yeah, we're gonna see more challenges in that space. That's going to be very interesting. And on that note, and I know Stephen, you made some comments last year about M&A and also that, you know, coming together of fintechs, banks, and payments generally. What are you seeing coming up for 2021?
Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll just be really brief, just to add on to that growing list. I think Q5 will be very busy for all of us. A couple of things. One is we will see an increasing popularity of buy now, pay later. We already seen that in some countries. I think that will be more expensive. And there's already data coming out from retailers that when they do offer that option of installments, their checkout increased by 30%. So the sales increase as a result of that option. So we'll see that popularity be more and more mainstream. Second is around social causes. I think to Aman's earlier point about financial inclusion, I think what the pandemic has taught us was that not only is there a digital divide, is when there are crises, those who are not within the financial system, it's hard to get help into them. So we have seen that in some jurisdictions of government stimulus to help small and medium-sized businesses, to help communities of needs. They don't have digital payments, they don't have financial accounts, and it's hard to get help to them in time. And PayPal has participated in the US popular PPP program, and we have seen that fintech is able to fill that gap. And I think in this post-COVID era, the focus will be how do we bring in the banks into to be more financially inclusive. And so we'll see that as a theme. The other around social causes is sustainability. I think that there will be an increasing focus on climate change, green financing, ESG, and how can fintech, payments, tech play a role in supporting that and accelerating those goals. And then lastly, our CEO, Dan Schulman, likes to talk about a super app. I think there has been studies now that, even in our daily lives now, everything requires downloading apps, for water, utilities, telephone. How many apps do we have in a smartphone? And so there have been studies that are coming out now that an average person could only manage 6 to 8 apps at one time. And so as we are in this digital payments, digital finance age, I think consumers like yourself, like myself, are looking for one-stop shop. We're looking for an e-wallet that is more expansive than digital payments. How do we able to transact online and offline? An app that allow us to manage our money, our cash flows. So I think we'll see the evolution of these e-wallet apps, of these payment apps, to become more expansive in offering services where allow consumer to have that one-stop shop. And it's the super app, I think, where you will see companies aspire to be that.
Yeah, I certainly look forward to a super app doing more of my work for me in terms of the payments function. But Stephen, I'll just draw on one point you made about the sustainability. And Tony Craddock, the Director General in the UK, last week interviewed David Craig, the CEO of Refinitiv, on this really important topic of sustainable finance. And it's, I think it is going to be a big theme, because it does absolutely, the backbone of that is payments, infrastructure, inclusion, and I think it's something we need to think about ourselves for next, in the coming year too. Okay, so I'm just wondering if we could just launch the next poll. It was just a simple question, really, just around what the audience think the trend of digital payments is. We did launch it also on LinkedIn, and I'll share those results with you. So if you just have a quick thought about that. And yeah, so people starting their voting there. Okay, so I just wanted to jump into a couple of quick fire questions here. So, and I think Stephen, well, I think you've pretty much answered the question here, but I just wanted to see if there's anything else based on now what we've talked about in 2021 predictions. Was there anything else in terms of, the regulator, as we saw, shifted focus? Some of the regulations were pushed out, as you've identified. But based on now what we're saying are the trends, what should we, or what could we expect that we haven't sort of already considered for 2021 in terms of the regulations?
I think there will be an increasing focus around how do they have better oversight of understanding and oversight of emerging technologies. How do regulated entities apply and use AI, data, blockchain, and what are the right oversights and controls in place for them to feel secure, and that there are right level of protection and security in place to protect consumers and businesses. So I do think that will be something that the regulators will continue to put a focus on, and also the rise of biometrics as well, digital ID, but also facial recognition, fingerprints, and that goes into Andy's earlier point about the 3Ds. Data. How do we keep privacy in consumer privacy of those data? And so I think that will be another theme I would highlight.
Andy, you put your hand up there. Did you want to share a comment?
Yeah, thanks, John. So I completely agree with what Stephen said. I think also I'd expect more and more regulators to be serious about being principles based and probably activity based as part of that. I think regulators increasingly face the issue that innovation outstrips regulation every time, and it now does it quicker than ever, and therefore regulators moving to more of a principles-based style of regulation, I think is really important to support that innovation, but also to make sure that they can continue to protect consumers and end users more generally. Within a style of regulation that means it's a level playing field, right? It's same risk, same rules, and I think you can see some regulators have already leapt to that. Switzerland's a really outstanding example of that, but I'd expect that as a trend in regulation more broadly.
Great point. And Aman, did you want to add something from the Northern Hemisphere perspective?
Yes. I've got very dramatic lighting. My light has gone out. So
very cool.
I think on the point of regulation, I think we've seen a couple of things happening. And one of the things is regulators have turned a little bit cautious in 20. And I think it's important for them to realize their role in moving incumbents along and just making things better. It's really tough. Regulators are in a very awkward position because the natural push to innovation is to say no. And many regulators want to see payments and other areas of the financial services being regulated. And then there's a drag from an incumbent saying, well, that looks like too hard. You're putting too many regulations on us. And I think those principles and having more tech savvy regulators to realize when certain smoke is being blown in certain people's eyes is just that, right? I think one of the reasons why ISO 20022 took so long to be adopted is that, right? It's not that hard. Banks started working on it over a decade ago, right? It's just incumbency drags the feet. And what we need now in this more agile age is regulators to create space through principle-based regulation, but also allowing a little bit more failure to happen in the market. It's not the end of the world.
Excellent. Thanks, Aman. I'm just going to bring up the results from the earlier survey. Anyone dare to make an obvious comment here about this?
Well, I talked about digital experiences being sticky. I think that's what you're hearing, isn't it? That it's sticky, and then not only do I keep using the digital experience that I've grown to love, but I tell all my friends about it, and away we go. So and I think that's all good news if we want to see innovation in that space, and certainly if Aman and I are going to see our digital identity predictions come true, then it has to be a good thing.
Yeah, and I think it adds to Danielle's point earlier. It's just getting bigger, and we're growing, so that's a good thing. But it's going to be growing pains, no doubt.
I think, John, sorry, before you move on, I think that the interesting point there, though, is the digital divide, right? Is how do you make sure that people who don't have access to those bits of technology don't get left behind? And I think we need to think about that societally, both, some of the countries across Asia in dealing with people who are unbanked, but and others in thinking about, issues like less cash rather than necessarily cashless, and how do you make sure that there's a fair go for all consumers and end users in that context?
Yeah, that was one of the questions that we did want to bring up, Andy. And during the great reset, we had the great growth of the digital divide. We see it in many different aspects. Did anyone else want to, I guess, share a perspective on dealing with that in terms of payments and how payments might be an enabler or a solution in that space?
I'd like to raise a point, I guess, because actually this sort of notion has actually started to be explored as well in some of the more recent work. So I think just over the Christmas break, we saw some surveys happen from the Financial Action Task Force. So this is the first part of the roadmap. But basically looking at whether or not there may also be some implications from the regulatory fragmentation. And certainly a lot of the feedback provided from the industry as part of their early consultation had been that, it's not just about, certainly the incumbency does definitely play a part, but certainly also recognizing that the uneven implementation of a lot of these standards by the countries themselves, which actually themselves also come from differentiated implementation of regulations over these different systems, does create challenges, because you then, particularly if you are an organization, whether bank or fintech, that operates across multiple jurisdictions where there are many different conditions, from the standards that are implemented by the actual local clearing systems through to the implementation of the regimes from an AML perspective. So you've got to kind of look at it from each of these different markets you operate, which obviously then starts to increase the cost of that. And that actually then adds to the challenges in actually being able to serve some of these consumers in some of these markets more cheaply, because a lot of the cost inefficiency will come from the inefficiency in actually delivering from either a compliance or an infrastructure perspective. So there is definitely still a role that the regulators do need to play in ensuring that there is a relatively more even application of regulatory standards across their different jurisdictions. And certainly it is encouraging to see that FATF certainly is taking a look at that. They're looking to review potentially the mutual evaluation program even. But I guess then the where this really needs to come, and the metal, or at least the sort of rubber needs to hit the road, is actually seeing how jurisdictions actually do that. I was certainly encouraged here in Hong Kong, for example, the local government is already consulting on some changes for digital identity. So looking to adopt a lot of the standards around digital identity, pave the way for that, looking to adopt the FATF standards around virtual asset service providers quite quickly. These are all encouraging moves, but we've got to see that in some of these other lesser developed markets in Asia where this tends to be more of a problem, I think.
Aman, did you have another point here, or is it just your hand up?
Yeah, just related to that, back in the early days when mobile wallets were first coming to the fore, a lot of regulation was introduced just to provide greater protection. But I think if you look at one of the reasons why digital and digitization hasn't been accepted by many in society or many parts of society, one is access to the tech, one is access to the devices, but the other is this well-meaning regulation has been overlaid, which actually acts as a barrier and a friction. So what we were seeing here in Europe during the COVID pandemic, members of society who just didn't have online banking, they were being excluded from groceries and things like that. And local action groups, communities would come into action. They would get the groceries. They would do that. A lot of the fintech banks, neo challengers here, they would issue please help me cards. So you would get another card issued, you'd hand it over to your helper, and they could use it as a debit card against your account. So I think we got to look at these sort of things to allow greater inclusion. And if you're interested in this area, there's been a lot of work done by the Access to Cash group here in the UK to see what are the drivers behind pardon me, people using cash in the UK. And it's these factors, but also you have more control in a cash world. If I have a stack of cash, that's what I have. And what's missing within the digital world is having those elements of control coming through. So there are a number of reasons why I think when we look at broader inclusivity, we've got to address these 5 or 6 major issues.
Right. I just got a note that Juanita Wood wants to ask a question, and I'm not quite sure how she's going to ask it. If she's
oh no, I've added her so she can speak. Janita, please ask your question.
No. Okay.
Still unable to hear you, Janita. Are you there?
All right. Okay. We'll just get in the interest of time. We're almost getting there.
Can I just add a quick comment around, to that Daniela's point about standardization? I think we're lucky, Hong Kong and Singapore that has one regulator looking after banking, payments, securities. Well, not so much in Hong Kong, but that helps with the regulatory architecture. But I do think that payment accelerated so fast and still under some legacy oversight. And so you have jurisdictions where prudential regulators have pieces of it, central bank have pieces of it, Ministry of Finances have some pieces of it on the FX piece, and it makes it very challenging in terms of getting all the right compliance in place, the right licensing in place. And to Daniel's point, it increases costs, and sometimes it creates a lot of also confusion because there are different guidance. So I do think as we, as payment become more mature, and as we've seen in the poll, many expect to increase significantly post-COVID. I do think that there has to be a relook at the entire regulatory architecture around payments, because now it's become a bit more sophisticated. And I think also there's already a lot of existing compliance structure in place, whether with bank partnership, credit card partnership. So I do think there are opportunities to we look holistically around that piece of.
Great. Andy, do you want to?
I completely agree. I think I think the basis of that is that really payments have never been regulated as a concept. Largely the regulation of payments is actually about the value of money when it stood still. It's really about deposits. It's not about transfer of value, a payment. And therefore you end up with exactly what Stephen's described, that different regulators own a different aspect of the payment journey, and that is a problem. We just published at AusPayNet published a guide around navigating payments in Australia, targeting fintech, so they can actually understand what the different payment systems are, but also what the different licensing arrangements are. So to Dan's point, because otherwise it's confusing and it's a real cost. And you shouldn't need to be an expert in this stuff to get things done. So I think there are different solutions for that. I said earlier, moving regulators to that principle-based style of regulation. Other countries have tried to crack it through one payment system regulator, but sometimes that's an additional regulator, and you actually add to the problem rather than solving it. And another way of trying to solve it is better coordination between the regulators and the industry. But you're absolutely highlighting a real problem that needs to be solved there, Stephen.
Coordination amongst regulators. That'd be nice in India, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely something that we know is on the agenda for this year, and we have it as part of our submission. It's a theme that we want to bring to some of the regulators in the region on that very point. And we'll be talking to some of the colleagues in Pay UK as well, who've obviously gone through that in the near past. So we're at the final moment, and obviously it's been very exciting today. We've had the best acronyms I've heard so far: Q5, the 3Ds, the 7Fs. We've heard it all in terms of where we're going. So I think there's a lot of things to digest here. We'll certainly put into an article after this event. But key is now we've locked in all these predictions for next year. So you as the panel are all ready to be enabled for the Sage of Payments for 2021. But on that note, we have to award the Sage of Payments for 2020. And with due consideration and listening to the recording from last year many times, we have decided to award that to Andy White for his contribution and comments around resilience, obviously the trend of mobile, and I guess just understanding that the real-time payment networks and the implications of those, across the region, that we will start to see. They've happened now, so we're going to see those develop. So congratulations, Andy. You must be delighted with this, and I hope this only furthers your what you add to the industry, as we know is very significant.
Thank you, John. I put some extra grey in my beard today just to live up to the reputation of being a sage, by the way. But no, thank you very much, and I wish all the rest of the panel well for 2021 and that award.
Excellent, great. So without further ado, then we'll just complete today's event. And apologies, there were some questions there we didn't get to today, but we will reach out to some of those people and talk to them. And I know the panel had the side chat going there. So in closing, we obviously want to thank Camilla and her team for the assistance in getting this event together and getting everyone in the room. I will say that we have published our events lineup, and next week we have another session on cyber, and really this is a full agenda we're looking forward to this year. So certainly look out all those key themes: cross-border, digital identity. We'll see more of open banking, regulations. You're going to hear a lot more of. So lots to be done, and the Meet Her project will go from strength to strength this year too. That is it, and you will see some more publications around this, and we will be contributing, as we do always, to B1 G1, our charity, to help those who are less fortunate and to get them the education that we're all experiencing right now. So thank you again to the panel. That was some very thought-provoking comments, and hopefully we'll get to keep this discussion going throughout the year now as well in 2021.